Hi there. So today we're going to talk about protecting embedded systems and also industrial systems. I'm going to talk about them together because they share some functionality, especially when it comes to security or how painful implementation of security is with devices such as these. So let's dig in. So what exactly is an embedded system? Well, simply put, an embedded system is a very simple computer designed to perform one single simple task. And the reason why we are talking about both embedded systems and industrial systems is that from this perspective, they kind of share the same functionality, share the same limitations, right? Doing one thing and one thing only is something that sounds like a sensor in your smart home, maybe a remote control activating a gate, or some robotic arm that is assembling a specific piece on an assembly line. And they're considered to be static. That is, you're not able to change anything about the configuration of the software in that small computer or the applications and the lines of code that the computer is executing. Now, from a security perspective, this might sound great. I mean, you've just described something that cannot be hacked. Indeed, but the problem here is, what if those devices have some flaws, have some vulnerabilities that at some point are being discovered? What can you do about them? Well, unfortunately, not much. And the consequence of these devices being relatively simple and relatively cheap in many cases is the fact that they rely on a very simplistic hardware and resource-constrained hardware. They don't really have a very powerful CPU, they don't have a lot of memory, or at least not more memory than it's required for them to perform that simple task that they were designed for. And also, most of them rely on batteries. Many sensors out there for smart parking, smart cities, smart agriculture, for example, they all rely on batteries that can last them for years, as long as they keep performing the same function over and over. And also, remember we said that they are static by definition. And they are, but also due to the fact that they run on such constrained hardware, you're not even able, let's assume that you would be able to change the code on an embedded device. You just don't have enough resources on that device to do anything more than it was designed to do. So you have no room to run an anti-malware software in there. You have no room to run a small firewall or an intrusion detection agent. They're just not able to perform these advanced security functions. And what's even worse is that by default, most of them don't even implement any security functions. Or if they do, they're so weak that they're almost irrelevant. They use very weak security ciphers, they're not able to perform any complex cryptographic operations, and also they don't really pose any kind of protection against physical tampering, which is a real risk because now we're talking about devices that run code which is not located in the premises of your company. It might be in some field on a highway, it might be attached to the outside of a building, where everybody can reach it, perhaps, and everybody can tamper with it. So from a networking perspective, at least, those devices that do need to communicate over a network can only be protected by using the tried and tested method of perimeter protection. So just protect the network that leads to the device if you cannot protect the device itself. And you're not going to find a TPM chip in some simple embedded system. So you're going to have to rely on the assumption that the system is trustworthy. Now, what the embedded systems are actually running as code is more often than not referred to as firmware. We're not talking about full-blown operating systems here, but some small piece of code, limited code, called a firmware. And that code is stored on something called a programmable logic controller, or a PLC. Now, while there are many types of PLCs out there, most of them are designed from the ground up in a completely different manner that we've gotten used to from your PC and mobile world. A normal desktop computers or laptop computers, as you probably know, they're relying on separate components like a CPU and a memory and bus and external interfaces, and so on. Now, we also have implementations called system on a chip, where all these components are built into one single chip. Now, Raspberry Pi, for example, that's an example of my Raspberry Pi right here, is an example of a system on a chip, right? Everything here is on this single board that single processor right there in the middle, but it also works as a general purpose computing system. So you can see right here, I do have a power connector, I do have an HDMI, I do have an audio jack, also have a bunch of USB ports, right? Even an RG45 network connector. Also have access to additional storage using this huge SD card inserted right there, and can also work as a general purpose machine. All right, but it's everything built into one single chip. Now, this is not exactly as static as the embedded device that we talked about before, because you do have the opportunity to run whatever code you want on this piece of hardware, and it's quite powerful actually. I've been using this Raspberry Pi here to perform transcoding, even for 4K movies. So it's much higher in the food chain when talking about embedded systems. We call them mini computers, right? Raspberry Pi is one example of this. Arduino is another example, even though Arduinos are notoriously known for having very low resources available for programming, especially if you want to implement any security functions in there. Now, I had the opportunity to try and program an Arduino for an IoT device a while back, where I was actually baffled by the fact that I hit the upper limit of the memory on that device when I tried to load just the certificate chain, the CA certificate chain, for me to be able to initiate a connection to some remote destination over the internet. That's all I tried to do. The moment I tried to load a simple certificate chain, I realized I've just eaten up all the memory on that device, which was kind of disappointing because I had to reprogram that device to communicate in clear text with some local proxy, and then transpose those messages into HTTPS connections in order to communicate with the actual cloud destination that I was trying to send those messages to. So not all systems on a chip are built equal. Some of them have more resources than others, obviously. And remember, these devices are not here just to be protected. Sometimes these devices are used as the tools of a hacker, simply because they're so portable, they're so small, and they're so powerful, some of them at least. Firmware can either run on an ASIC or an FPGA. Now, an ASIC, an application-specific integrated circuit. An ASIC is designed to perform one single purpose, or just a very limited set of instructions. That's why ASICs are basically hard-coded from the factory by the vendor. You can find ASICs in dedicated devices such as Ethernet switches, for example, which are always going to be doing the same thing, right? Grab one frame from one port and then look up in the TCAM table the destination, forward it on another port, and so on and so forth, billions of times every second. You can abstract this functionality using an ASIC because you're most likely never going to have to replace that piece of code that actually takes care of pushing the packets around inside of a switch. Another place where you can find ASICs are in security devices that can perform SSL encryption or SSL offloading, for example. In other words, you're going to find this, and especially in data sheets out there, as a hardware accelerated engine, or something that is hardware decryption or hardware encryption. That basically means that there is a dedicated processor in there, most likely an ASIC, that can only do one thing, right? Apply a specific encryption or decryption algorithm with a specific key to its input data. Now, ASICs are notoriously fast because they can be designed from ground up to perform just a simple set of operations, and then they will always perform that set of operations with the same speed. So they're very fast and predictable. Unfortunately, they cannot be changed. So they need to be written from factory. The code that is executed in an ASIC is always defined from the factory. FPGAs, on the other hand, field programmable gate arrays, just like the name says, programmable, is like an ASIC that can be reprogrammed. So it allows you to rewire the internal circuitry inside of that chip in order for it to run whatever code you want it to run. A specialized type of embedded system is a device that runs a real-time operating system. Real-time operating systems are used in environments where you need extreme predictability as to how long is a specific operation going to last, especially in assembly lines, for example. Robot arms that assemble your electronic devices, your cars, your anything, basically. Now, the Upside of this is the fact that you have a system, a complex system that is always going to behave exactly the same way. So it's never going to be delayed. It's never going to be interrupted to perform something else. A general purpose computer, like the one that you have in front of you, has the concept of an interrupt. When a packet comes over the network, it receives an interrupt so that the packet can be safely processed. When an input comes back from you, like you click the mouse, you press the key on the keyboard, there's an interrupt sent to the operating system, to the CPU, telling it, careful, something happened. Make sure you do something with this event. Now, real-time operating system doesn't do this. A real-time operating system cannot be interrupted, specifically because there are no CPU cycles left for anything else. Unfortunately, no CPU cycles left, including for security functions. So just like the problem that we introduced at the very beginning, RTOSs cannot be safely protected by configuring them or installing an additional security functions onto them. And unfortunately, this makes them extremely easy and susceptible to denial of service attacks. In a real-time operating system, you don't really need to deny the availability of the system for too long. It might be enough to just delay one operation for 1/10 of a second to mess up the entire assembly line. That's how sensitive these can be. So what can you do? Well, if you cannot secure them by themselves, monitor them and make sure that you implement some sort of perimeter security, right? Make sure that they're not exposed to the outside world, or if they are, they have to be, you thoroughly analyze and filter whatever type of connections or traffic can reach them. So how do these embedded systems talk to each other? And unfortunately, they do have to talk to each other or to some central applications out there, because if you have an embedded system that cannot be controlled remotely, then it's probably useless. Also, if you have some sort of a sensor that is unable to report back to you whatever they're sensing, it's also kind of useless. So we do need some specialized networks or some sort of network connectivity, at least, for these embedded systems in order for them to be able to report back to us and also for us to tell them what to do. And a generic term, it's more like a marketing term, but I don't want to go there. It's called an operational technology network. And an OT network is basically any type of network that is involved in some sort of an industrial environment, that is used in some sort of an industrial environment. Now, the protocols used in OT could be Ethernet, right? And in most cases, we're going to be talking about industrial Ethernet, which is the same Ethernet, but with some enhancements that allow it to work better for real-time operating systems and to be more resilient. Okay, and also in some situations, these OT networks can rely on serial protocols, but this can be found less and less nowadays. And since we're stepping away from serial protocols or proprietary protocols and stepping closer to what's more convenient nowadays to use, one solution, especially for devices that are spread over a wide geographical area, is to use cellular connectivity, just like your mobile phone. And just like your mobile phone, it's going to rely on some sort of an identity, which is provided in a serial network by the SIM card or the subscriber identity module, which nowadays can also be virtual as well. But you do need this type of identity in order to be able to communicate over a provider's cellular network. Also, just like your mobile phone, if you keep sending data over the cellular connection, your battery is going to drain quite fast. So unfortunately, for IoT devices that rely on cellular connectivity, we also have a slightly modified version of the LTE protocol, or the 4G implementation protocol, called NB-IoT, Narrowband IoT protocol. It's a low power LTE version that is designed to not eat up so much battery, of course, but is also limited in bandwidth. Now, for most implementations out there, especially in IoT, bandwidth is not really a concern. We much better prefer to send small chunks of data at regular intervals rather than eating up a huge chunk of the bandwidth, pushing a lot of data at the same time. But in case that you actually need a lot more bandwidth, not more, but just a bit more, we also have an implementation called LTE-M, which is not less than 100 kilobits per second, like with NB-IoT, but it's capped somewhere next to 1 megabit per second. So still, we're not talking about streaming video data, right? But we are talking about the minimum amount of bandwidth that is given to us in order for our sensors to be able to report in real time their findings. Encryption for networks such as these, as you can probably guess, it's the operator's responsibility. So between you and a cell tower, you have some sort of encryption that is managed by the operator. Between cell towers, or between the cell tower and the actual backbone network up to the actual destination of your data, again, it's the provider's responsibility. In many cases, it's IPsec, and many cases you have no idea what it is actually. Also for IoT devices, especially those used in smart homes, you're going to find protocols such as Z-Wave or Zigbee. You're going to find a couple of details right here on the slide, but long story short, if you're buying something from, let's say, Philips Hue or IKEA Tradfree, the smart home set of devices from IKEA, those are going to be using Zigbee. And Zigbee is all over the place nowadays. It has a good range, it has a lot of flexibility, and it's widely supported by a lot of vendors out there. And by the way, both of them have built-in encryption, so your traffic is not on clear text, just in case somebody lied to you about this. But they're still vulnerable to deauthentication attacks, where an attacker can force a simple small device, such as a sensor, to go off the network and then try to reconnect in an attempt to break the authentication key and the encryption key, for that matter. Going away from our smart home and closer to our workplace, perhaps, industrial systems or industrial control systems, ICSs. Now, these are smart systems designed to control industrial processes or industrial machinery. One of their major flaws is the fact that they are designed with functionality in mind. That is, it has to work. The assembly line has to work. The water operating valves has to work. The gas sensors have to work. Whatever you're building in that factory has to work. And security is just an afterthought. That is, does not so much focus on confidentiality or integrity of the data that these systems are using. And also, don't forget that priority number one in many situations, especially for dangerous environments, is human safety. So we're going to focus on safety first, we're going to focus on functionality second, and if we have time and people to do this, maybe we'll think about security as well. The entire industrial control system is made up of a bunch of devices connected over an OT network, since we're talking about an industrial environment. And basically, there are all a bunch of PLCs being controlled remotely or reporting back to a centralized application. That application is generically called a human-machine interface or an HMI, and in most cases this is just a general-purpose computer or general-purpose operating system designed to run an application that can control the entire ICS system. This is also where you find the term of SCADA, supervisory control in data acquisition, which is a very fancy way of saying multiple ICSs spread all over the place, perhaps even across a country, and controlled from a centralized location. Again, that centralized location can actually be a software application running on a general purpose computer. And again, we're talking about a bunch of PLCs that can be controlled remotely and can report back to us their current status. And again, since the focus is on functionality and safety, in many situations, there's no built-in security into any of these systems. If you never heard about Stuxnet, written just like this on the screen, I would encourage you to Google it. It was an attack designed to damage the centrifuges or being controlled by the SCADA software in Iran's nuclear program. You can see how a very simple piece of software can alter the functionality of a SCADA system when there's no security built into it. I'll leave you to find out more about this. There's some very interesting YouTube videos about this as well. I'll not go into further details here, but I would strongly encourage you to find out more about this. We did mention them briefly before, but Internet of Things is just a type of network made up of a bunch of devices that have two abilities. First of all, they have sensors. They have the ability to extract information from the environment. And secondly, they have an ability to connect over a network and report back to some, maybe perhaps to your own hub in your home, maybe to a cloud application in the vendor's cloud, maybe to some other solutions or software solution that you might have chosen to administer that specific IoT installation, such as Home Assistant, for example. Most of them use technologies such as Z-Wave or Zigbee. That is, they're going to be using these protocols to reach a hub or a central entity that in turn can then connect over a regular network and reach other applications or even the internet. Widely found as sensors, widely found in all types of home automation solutions. We have now a bunch of vendors out there, one of them worse than the other, manufacturing these devices with very little focus on security. That is because they are trying to make these IoT devices as friendly as possible, and I must say that they have succeeded into attracting a wide audience to these IoT devices, but the audience is not always so technologically savvy, is not always so security conscious. And unfortunately, this is not really a downside from their perspective, because if the public doesn't know to ask about the security of a system, doesn't know what the security should look like, then lack of it doesn't become a showstopper. And people still buy these sensors, then they still buy these security, so-called home security solutions out there that might be painfully insecure. That's why I like to call it Internet of Threats instead of Internet of Things. Some of the security risks worth mentioning here is the fact that many IoT devices cannot be upgraded. Some of them are not even thoroughly documented, so you don't know exactly what it does and what type of data it's sending and where is it sending to. And also, their initial security configuration might be extremely weak. Sometimes you don't even get a chance to change those defaults. And IoT devices are not just found in smart homes, but it can also be used in industrial systems, and especially in smart meters. For example, the electricity meter for my house, I never have to read it, I never have to report it, because it automatically reports every hour back to the electricity provider its current consumption. That's a type of IoT device. Other types of embedded systems can be found in the so-called smart buildings. And we're talking here about office buildings mostly. These are called building automation systems. Those are the centralized smart systems that can control a bunch of stuff inside of a large building, starting from lighting to the way elevators work, power, HVAC, and so on. Room occupancy, perhaps even. They're nice to have, nice to use, but unfortunately, even though a lot of people appreciate what these systems are doing, not many people think about the fact that these are separate ID systems that need to be part of a security assessment, need to be patched regularly, need to be evaluated, need to be scanned, need to be included in a vulnerability scan perhaps. And more often than not, it happens that these so-called smart systems are abandoned for years, ever since the building was built perhaps, and nobody remembers about them whenever security assessments are performed. The assumption in many cases is that these are by themselves isolated systems which somehow should not be protected. Of course, this is not true, especially because they're most likely not that isolated as the IT department would think. As long as they do have a web interface to perform management from, well, that web interface can also be hijacked, can also be hacked, especially if it's running on some legacy, very old device using some very old versions of web servers that have a bunch of vulnerabilities. Denial of service attacks can be performed as well. Now, you could threaten a company to burn down their data center by shutting down the air conditioning in there. And inherently, they, just like the SCADA and ICS systems, they're not really designed with security in mind. You're going to find hard-coded credentials in these systems. You're going to find that a lot of them still work with the default admin passwords that they were shipped maybe 10 years ago when the company first moved into the building. And another type of very dangerous embedded system or device that can be found virtually anywhere is a multifunctional printer. Now, these printers, which are pretty smart the way they're designed, they're basically small computers, but everybody forgets about this. Everybody forgets about the fact that even though we keep on a patch management process and we keep updating the workstations and the servers and the virtual machines and the networking equipment, nobody cares about those poor printers. And it's not that those printers really need new functionality, as in what the printer is doing right now, it could be doing 10 years from now just as well. But those small computers have a bunch of vulnerabilities. Let me show you this. Here's a well-known article in the security environment. So it's about the ability of hacking a multifunctional printer using just regular user privileges from a user on the same network as the printer. Hack it to run the game Doom on it. So that's a small screen right here on the actual printer. You can see it's running Doom, right? Search for this one. It's a well-known article on Wired. You can just Google it for it as a printer running Doom or Doom on printer. Have fun with it. After you have fun with it, try to think about how dangerous this really is. I mean, with no privileges, just a regular user, if you're able to do something like this on a printer that lives and breathes in the middle of your enterprise network, how bad is security for these devices, actually? The cars that we're driving, the drones that we're flying, for fun perhaps, they're also examples of embedded systems. And we can see more and more of these systems being made available into commercial devices and commercial vehicles especially. Now, it all started with simple entertainment features perhaps, but nowadays we can remote start our car, we can remotely start the heating in our car seats, we can locate the car over GPS, and we can even enable some self-driving features. So you see more and more of these seemingly separate systems being mashed together into a single device, a single large vehicle. Now, officially, the way these subsystems are interconnected is that each system is actually called an ECU, an electronic control unit, and all these systems are connected over a single network called a CAN bus, a controller area network bus. The CAN bus, or multiple buses, also have external interfaces. Often they are called OBD, or onboard diagnostic interfaces. Now, it's that port in your car, if you ever found it, that is, where you can connect external devices like diagnostic computers or external peripherals, such as DBS tracking devices, perhaps. What's bad about the CAN bus is that, again, it was designed with no security in mind. It's very similar to Ethernet, and actually it's very similar to the old Ethernet back to the coaxial cable many years ago, in which every message is actually a broadcast. So there's no security, there's no authentication, there's no encryption, there's no privacy over that network, so that whoever is connected to the OBD port on your car, or whoever manages to attach a malicious device to the OBD port on your car, can actually mess up the entire vehicle really badly. Here's another well-known example of hackers remotely killing a Jeep on the highway, right? Just by accessing it over a cellular connection. Another category of embedded systems with a high risk are medical devices. And we're not just talking about those medical devices that run inside of a hospital, but also wearable devices that monitor your heart, your blood, whatever, concentration, pressure, oxygen, and so on. These devices, again, are not designed with security in mind, and they are extremely risky if they are to be exposed to an intruder or any type of malicious intent. The risk here is not just physical risk to the patient, but also the risk of accessing unauthorized personal health information. All right, so how do you secure that which cannot be secured in embedded systems? Well, first of all, we can start by isolating them as much as possible. So segmenting networks. You can do this with VLANs, with routers, with firewalls. Just make sure you have some way of deciding which traffic enters or leaves that specific network where your embedded systems are communicating. It might not be enough because some of these systems might require outside communication, and the actual protocol or the interface that they're using to communicate with the outside world might be the vulnerable one. So you might not be getting rid of any vulnerabilities by segmenting the network, as long as you still need to offer network connectivity to those devices. You can also add security on top of it. That is, if you know you have a couple of devices that have no security built in, especially regarding confidentiality, perhaps, right? There's no way to protect or hide that data from prying eyes or from sniffing. Well, then how about running on that specific network segment an always on IPsec tunnel, let's say, or with MACsec encryption if possible. So as long as you cannot secure the actual data or the protocol used by those devices, try to transmit that data over an already secured line, already secured virtual connection, such as a VPN. Keep an eye on the update process or patch management for these devices. In the lucky scenario where the updates can be installed, you might end up realizing that the updates for IoT devices have to be performed manually, so they cannot be included in some sort of an automatic patching system. Take care of that, right? If it's manual, at least it's something. But more often than not, it's going to happen that some of these devices, especially over time, are not going to be able to be patched anymore, or they will simply not have any further security updates. So you have to decide then if you still keep them in your network, or you implement some other security measures to protect against potential disastrous vulnerabilities. Finally, as a last resort, air gapping means that you're simply completely isolating the network your embedded systems are running on from the rest of the world, or even from the rest of your internal network. Air gapping means that there is no physical connection, there's no physical link between that isolated network and the rest of the world. In practice, this becomes an administrative burden because you're not going to be able to remotely administer that network segment. If you need to connect to those devices, you will have to physically become part of that isolated network first, connect to it first, and then gain access to your devices for patching purposes or for their basic functionality, right? To extract the information that they're sending to you, perhaps. But in actual implementations, this can also be performed using something called a data diode. If you never heard about this, let me show you one. A data diode is a dedicated equipment, physical equipment, that is designed to allow communication to flow only one way. So for example, you could allow your sensors network to report back some statistics to you, but they will never be able to be reached from the outside network in an intrusion attempt, for example. So a data diode does this, but you might say that, okay, I can do this with a firewall as well. Yes, but firewalls can be hacked. And why do data diodes cannot be hacked? Well, that's because they are physically wired. They're physical electrical connectors or physical optical connectors. You have both types of data diodes in here. Their internal connections are wired in such a way so that it's physically impossible for an electrical or an optical signal to flow the other way around. That's why they cannot be hacked, right? Because there's simply no physical connection available in there. Now, some of them are optimized in order to provide some connectivity to their clients, especially for protocols that require some sort of a back and forth communication. If you just think about TCP, right? In order to perform that three-way handshake, you do need bidirectional communication. So the data diode actually takes care of some of this responsibility of establishing and maintaining the connection for those protocols that rely on bidirectional communication, even though the actual endpoints behind that protected network are not able to receive that type of traffic because it cannot flow back to them. So you can see that many diodes here do have support for standard UDP or TCP or file exchange, such as FTP or SMB or NFS file transfer, because you do need some sort of functionality, but you need to make sure that there's no way in hell in which somebody from the outside is going to be able to initiate a connection to those devices inside your protected network. So that's a data diode. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, they're just little boxes with a couple of interfaces, most likely two of them, right? An inside and an outside interface, which can be optical or copper-based depending on the type of the diode. All right, that's it for today about securing the unsecurable. Hopefully I've managed to open your eyes a bit regarding how many dangers lurk everywhere around you or even on you, right? Wearable devices. So thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. Until then, like, subscribe, support the channel if you can, if you want, if you must, and see you on the next video. Bye bye.